news cycle has a remarkable talent for behaving like an over-caffeinated squirrel. 1 minute it's racing toward one shiny object, the next it's forgotten that object entirely because something even shinier rolled into view. That particular week was a perfect example. Congress had just passed what many described as the largest investment in fighting climate change in American history, the sort of legislation that would normally dominate headlines for days. Under ordinary circumstances, every panel discussion, every cable news chyron and every social media debate would have revolved around it. Instead, the attention of the entire country swerved somewhere else almost instantly. The FBI executed a search warrant at Mar-a-Lago, and just like that, everything changed. Within hours, speculation exploded in every conceivable direction. Television hosts scrambled for guests. Political commentators immediately separated into predictable camps. Social media transformed into an enormous shouting match in which nearly everyone possessed absolute certainty, despite admitting they knew almost nothing. The facts available at that moment were surprisingly limited. Investigators had searched the former president's Florida residence and removed documents. Reports suggested some of those materials included classified information, including documents connected with nuclear matters. Beyond that, enormous questions remained unanswered. Yet uncertainty has never stopped people from forming passionate opinions. Some political allies described the search as outrageous government overreach. Others compared federal law enforcement to authoritarian secret police. Still others attempted to minimize whatever documents might have been involved by suggesting that the phrase nuclear information could refer to all sorts of relatively harmless material. Listening to some of those explanations required a remarkable suspension of disbelief. Sometimes you hear someone speaking and, before they've even finished the sentence, you can almost imagine their own conscience quietly whispering, "Please stop talking." That seemed to be one of those moments. Yes, governments classify far too many documents. Yes, information exists on the internet that probably shouldn't. But those realities alone hardly explain why federal investigators would seek a search warrant for the home of a former president. That isn't the sort of decision made casually. It represents an extraordinary step, one that inevitably raises extraordinary questions. Still, there simply wasn't enough verified information available to draw sweeping conclusions. So rather than sprint towards speculation, I found myself thinking about something that had almost completely disappeared from American conversation. Afghanistan. Exactly 1 year had passed since the United States completed its withdrawal. It was astonishing how quickly that story had faded from everyday discussion. Not because it had become less important. Quite the opposite. The crisis had simply continued without the cameras. Almost everyone remembers those final images. Crowds pressing desperately toward airport gates. Families trying to escape. People clinging to hope with extraordinary determination while uncertainty surrounded every decision. Those scenes were impossible to forget. The photographs alone seemed destined to become defining images of an era. One image showed a Marine lifting a baby over a wall topped with barbed wire. Another showed hundreds of people packed inside a military transport aircraft, an image so overwhelming that even experienced service members struggled to believe what they were seeing. The withdrawal unfolded with breathtaking speed. Events that experts believed might unfold over months instead collapsed into days. The Afghan government fell with astonishing rapidity. Even the Taliban appeared surprised by how quickly events unfolded. That realization alone said quite a bit. If the people benefiting from your strategic decisions are surprised by how successful those decisions turned out to be, perhaps something didn't unfold according to plan. Military leaders later acknowledged they had badly misjudged the situation. Intelligence assessments failed to predict how rapidly the government would collapse. Senior officials admitted the forecasts had been wrong. There was no elaborate attempt to sugarcoat it, simply an acknowledgement that they had missed it. Those admissions mattered not because they erased what happened, nothing could do that, but because they highlighted an uncomfortable reality. 20 years of involvement had ended in a way almost nobody expected. The speed of the collapse stunned observers across the world. Of course, criticizing the withdrawal itself is entirely legitimate. Many Afghans who had worked alongside American forces remained in danger after the evacuation ended. Although tens of thousands reached safety, hundreds hundreds of thousands more still faced extraordinary risks because of their association with the United States. That reality deserved serious examination. But what interested me even more was what happened afterward, because once the last evacuation flights departed, Afghanistan gradually disappeared from American headlines. For many viewers, the story effectively ended there. For millions of Afghans, however, it was only beginning, and that's where the conversation truly needed to go. The country now faced an entirely different reality. The Taliban controlled Afghanistan. In the earliest days of their return to power, they seemed eager to present a carefully managed public image. Photographs appeared showing Taliban members visiting amusement parks. Others showed them strolling through zoos. The accompanying message was straightforward. Everything was normal. Life could continue. People could supposedly live peacefully under the new government. The public relations effort was almost surreal. It attempted to project calm through cheerful imagery, but amusement park rides and zoo visits could never answer the questions that actually mattered. People weren't primarily concerned about whether bumper cars remained available. They were worried about something much more fundamental: safety, freedom, rights, security, food, work, education, the everyday realities that determine whether families can build a future. Unfortunately, those realities looked far different than the carefully staged photographs suggested. Reports soon documented reprisals against former government employees and people associated with the previous administration. Many individuals disappeared. Others were killed. The promises of broad forgiveness quickly collided with deeply troubling reports from across the country, and women faced some of the most dramatic changes of all. During the previous 2 decades, Afghanistan had experienced meaningful, though incomplete, progress in women's education and public participation. Girls attended school in far greater numbers than they had 2 decades earlier. Women served in parliament. Professional opportunities expanded in many areas. Those achievements had never solved every problem, but they represented genuine progress. Now, much of that progress rapidly unravelled. The changes affecting women extended far beyond education. New decrees attempted to regulate nearly every aspect of daily life. Women were instructed to leave their homes only when considered necessary. Employment opportunities shrank dramatically. In many cases, only positions that authorities believed could not be filled by men remained available to women. Healthcare became one of the few exceptions, not because policymakers had suddenly embraced workplace equality. Rather, because in many situations, cultural rules prevented male medical workers from treating female patients. That practical reality left women working in hospitals, performing an impossible balancing act. They continued serving patients while watching opportunities disappear around them. One midwife expressed the situation with heartbreaking clarity. She explained that the authorities could hardly remove women from hospitals because women were desperately needed there. But she also pleaded for something much larger. She urged those in power not to interfere with women's education and employment, arguing that doing so amounted to removing one entire pillar supporting society. Her metaphor was impossible to ignore. A society, she argued, stands on 2 pillars, men and women. Remove one, and the entire structure becomes unstable. It was a remarkably simple explanation of an incredibly complicated national crisis. And honestly, it was difficult to disagree. History contains no shortage of examples showing what happens when half a population is prevented from fully participating in society. The consequences reach everyone. Then came another devastating announcement. Girls across most of the country would once again be prevented from receiving secondary education. That reversal shocked many observers. Even reports suggested disagreement existed among some members of the Taliban itself. Yet the policy moved forward. Officials insisted the suspension was temporary. One explanation offered was that authorities simply needed more time to determine an appropriate school uniform for teenage girls. That justification raised more questions than answers. If a nation has enough time to close classrooms indefinitely while still debating clothing, then perhaps the clothing isn't really the central issue. Meanwhile, daily life continued growing more difficult. Afghanistan wasn't facing only political upheaval. Nature had been relentlessly unforgiving. A severe drought affected much of the country, damaging food production on an enormous scale. Then came a powerful earthquake, flooding followed. Each disaster layered itself upon the previous one. Any government would have struggled under those circumstances, but Afghanistan's new leadership faced an additional challenge. Running a government requires very different skills from fighting an insurgency. For years, the Taliban had operated as an armed movement. Now they were expected to oversee ministries, budgets, infrastructure, healthcare systems, education, agriculture, banking, and every other responsibility associated with governing an entire nation. Those are not skills developed overnight. Building a bureaucracy differs considerably from organising a battlefield. That transition proved extraordinarily difficult. And then another problem emerged, one that received far less attention outside policy circles, but affected virtually every Afghan household: sanctions. Many Taliban officials had already been sanctioned individually before assuming governmental positions. Once those individuals occupied senior offices, those existing sanctions suddenly created enormous complications for the functioning of government itself. Banks hesitated. Businesses faced uncertainty. International organisations confronted legal and financial obstacles. Everything became more complicated. Even routine transactions suddenly carried significant risk. The consequences spread quickly. Before the Taliban takeover, roughly 3/4 of Afghanistan's government budget came from foreign assistance. That funding paid teachers, it supported healthcare, it maintained public services. Almost immediately after the change in government, much of that support disappeared. The effect was dramatic. Hospitals illustrated the problem vividly. Funding froze, medical supplies became scarce. Doctors and nurses continued reporting to work despite shrinking resources. One hospital administrator described the situation in painfully simple terms. When asked about the department's operating budget, the answer was startling: Zell. Not reduced, not significantly cut. Zell. Imagine trying to operate a hospital under those circumstances. Patients still arrive, emergencies continue, children still become sick, babies are still born, accidents still happen. Disease doesn't pause simply because accounting systems collapse, yet the money necessary to keep everything functioning had largely vanished. As if that weren't enough, another decision profoundly affected everyday life. Afghanistan's central bank assets held in the United States remained frozen. The purpose was understandable. Preventing those resources from reaching Taliban leadership represented an obvious policy objective. But central bank reserves don't exist solely for governments. They help stabilise national currencies. They support banking systems. They facilitate international trade. Without access to those reserves, Afghanistan's financial system seized up, banks lacked liquidity. Cash itself became scarce. People technically possessed money. They simply couldn't withdraw it. Long lines formed outside banks. Waiting several days to obtain one's own savings became increasingly common. It produced one of the strangest humanitarian crises imaginable. Food existed, markets still displayed products. Yet many families lacked usable cash with which to purchase them. The shelves weren't necessarily empty. Wallets effectively were. That distinction matters enormously. For means often conjure images of barren fields and absent harvests. Here, another reality emerged. Food could exist while remaining financially unreachable. Economic paralysis transformed availability into inaccessibility, and ordinary families paid the price. Children bore perhaps the greatest burden. Afghanistan has an exceptionally young population. Large numbers of children already faced nutritional challenges before these overlapping crises. Now, humanitarian organisations warned that severe malnutrition threatened extraordinary numbers of young lives. Those warnings were not abstract statistical exercises. Behind every number stood an individual child. A family. Parents confronting impossible choices, the kinds of choices no human being should ever have to make. Some people sold personal belongings, others exhausted savings. Still others borrowed money wherever possible. Eventually, many simply ran out of options. Reports emerged describing people selling kidneys to obtain enough money to feed their families. Think about that for a moment, selling an organ. Not for luxury, not for investment, not for business. For food, for survival. It's the sort of decision available only at once, and yet desperation pushed increasing numbers of people toward exactly that choice. Even more heartbreaking were reports that some families arranged marriages involving young daughters or sold children in desperate attempts to keep other family members alive. Those accounts represented the collapse of ordinary decision-making. Nobody wakes up hoping to make choices like that. Those decisions emerge only after countless alternatives have already disappeared. At this point, one obvious question hung over everything. What responsibility did the international community bear? The answer was anything but simple. On one hand, nobody wanted resources strengthening an extremist government with a deeply troubling record on human rights. That concern was entirely understandable. On the other hand, millions of ordinary Afghans had played no role in choosing that government. They nevertheless faced starvation. Humanitarian organisations argued that assistance could often reach civilians through mechanisms developed over many years, including periods when the Taliban already controlled substantial portions of the country. Aid workers understood the complexities. They had been navigating them long before the change in national leadership. One aid official posed the dilemma in unforgettable terms. Should an entire population of roughly 38 million people suffer because of the actions of a relatively small number of leaders? The arithmetic, he argued, simply didn't make sense. That wasn't merely an emotional appeal. It was a moral calculation. Punishing millions to isolate thousands carries consequences that extend far beyond politics. Emergency humanitarian assistance certainly helped. The United States announced exemptions, allowing certain aid to continue flowing. Hundreds of millions of dollars in humanitarian relief reached Afghanistan. Yet even supporters acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Emergency relief alone could never rebuild a country. Food deliveries matter, medical supplies matter, emergency shelters matter, but eventually nations require functioning schools, hospitals to Skrawka, agriculture, employment, banking systems, development rather than perpetual emergency. And development inevitably requires some level of engagement with whoever governs the country. That was the dilemma facing policymakers. There were no perfect options. Every possible decision carried risks, every delay carried consequences. The longer uncertainty persisted, the more ordinary Afghan families found themselves trapped between forces entirely beyond their control. By this point, it had become painfully obvious that Afghanistan's crisis couldn't be reduced to a single headline or a single political talking point. It wasn't simply about who controlled the government. It wasn't only about sanctions. It wasn't only about drought, earthquakes, inflation or humanitarian aid. It was all of those things happening simultaneously. Each crisis intensified the next. A collapsing economy made drought more devastating. A shortage of cash made food harder to obtain. Restrictions on women weakened the country's workforce. Natural disasters placed additional strain on already fragile institutions. Every problem multiplied another. That is precisely why simple answers sounded so appealing, and why they were almost always incomplete. One argument frequently surfaced. Why not simply refuse all assistance until the Taliban either changed their behaviour or lost power? At first glance, that position carried emotional weight. No one wanted resources strengthening an extremist government. No one wanted aid diverted toward people responsible for severe human rights abuses. Those concerns were entirely understandable, but there was another question that proved much harder to answer. What happens while everyone waits? Governments can survive hardship for surprisingly long periods. Ordinary people often cannot. Children don't postpone hunger until diplomatic negotiations conclude. Hospitals don't stop treating patients because sanctions policy remains under debate. Parents don't suddenly gain access to food simply because international leaders have adopted a morally satisfying position. Reality keeps moving every single day. The Afghan midwife, whose words echoed throughout this conversation, perhaps summarised the dilemma better than any politician could. She had already made clear she opposed restrictions imposed upon women. She wanted education. She wanted employment. She wanted opportunity. She certainly wasn't defending Taliban policies, yet even she argued that hunger had become so overwhelming that many families could no longer focus on anything beyond survival. When people are starving, discussions about future opportunities inevitably become secondary to staying alive today. It was an agonizing observation, not because it excused injustice, but because it recognized another tragedy unfolding simultaneously. A family watching a child go hungry cannot place tomorrow's debate ahead of today's emergency. Survival comes first, everything else follows. Fortunately, there were at least tentative signs that policymakers recognized the complexity of the situation. Discussions emerged about creating mechanisms that might release portions of Afghanistan's frozen financial assets without placing those resources directly under Taliban control. The concept attempted to strike a difficult balance. Inject liquidity into the country's financial system, support economic stability, avoid handing unrestricted control over billions of dollars to the governing authorities. Would such a plan solve every problem? Of course not. Nothing could. But perhaps it could prevent additional collapse. International organisations were also exploring ways to bridge the enormous gap between emergency humanitarian relief and longer-term development. Food assistance saves lives. Emergency medicine saves lives, but eventually nations require functioning institutions capable of sustaining themselves. Schools, hospitals, water systems, agriculture, fight risk off. Those investments require patience, funding, coordination. Most importantly, they require continued international attention, and attention, unfortunately, is often the first thing to disappear. That may have been the most unsettling lesson of all. A year earlier, Afghanistan dominated global headlines. Television broadcasts opened with it, front pages featured it, commentators debated it constantly. 12 months later, many people rarely discussed it at all. The suffering, however, had not disappeared simply because cameras had moved elsewhere. If anything, many aspects of the crisis had deepened. The withdrawal itself had been dramatic enough to capture worldwide attention. The slower humanitarian emergency that followed unfolded with far less visibility. Perhaps that's because slow-moving crises rarely compete successfully against breaking news. An airport evacuation produces unforgettable images. Economic collapse arrives one empty wallet at a time. A military withdrawal can be summarised in dramatic footage. Malnutrition spreads quietly, children lose weight gradually, hospitals exhaust supplies little by little, teachers go unpaid month after month. Those stories unfold without explosions, without dramatic music, without viral video clips, yet they shape millions of lives every single day. The uncomfortable reality was that no perfect solution existed. Every available option involved compromise. Every policy carried unintended consequences. Every delay imposed costs. The challenge wasn't choosing between a perfect outcome and a bad one. It was choosing among imperfect alternatives, while recognizing that doing nothing represented a decision in itself. Sometimes in public debate, inaction disguises itself as neutrality. It isn't. Choosing not to act still shapes events. It simply shifts responsibility onto those least able to bear it. That realization lingered long after the discussion of Afghanistan came to an end. Then, almost without warning, the tone shifted completely, because after spending so much time discussing war, humanitarian crises, economics, sanctions, and international policy, there was only one logical destination left: artificial intelligence creating bizarre pictures on the internet naturally, because apparently that's how modern civilization processes emotional whiplash. One moment humanity wrestles with geopolitical catastrophe. The next moment someone asks a computer to generate an image of a superhero made out of roast beef. And somehow the computer actually delivers. That alone was remarkable. You typed a sentence. A machine interpreted it. Within moments, original images appeared. Sometimes beautiful, sometimes confusing, often unintentionally hilarious. The technology seemed almost magical. Its greatest entertainment value wasn't merely that it produced pictures. It was how strangely it interpreted human imagination. Ask for something perfectly sensible, and occasionally you receive something wonderfully absurd. Ask for something already absurd, and somehow the computer became even more creative. Curiosity naturally led people to search increasingly ridiculous prompts. Late-night television hosts became popular subjects. Most generated only a handful of images, but one particular name produced hundreds Hundreds. Apparently, the internet had collectively decided that transforming one television host into every conceivable object, historical figure, microscopic organism, or surreal scenario represented an excellent use of advanced artificial intelligence. And honestly, looking through those creations, it was difficult to argue. There were portraits inspired by classical paintings, versions transformed into eggs, versions living impossibly strange alternate lives. Entire visual narratives emerged from random prompts, one creator apparently operating with unlimited imagination and perhaps an equally unlimited supply of recreational inspiration, constructed an entire saga centered around cabbages. It began innocently enough, confusion in a cabbage field, growing cabbages, teaching cabbage cultivation, throwing cabbages, eventually falling in love with a cabbage, naturally. Because once artificial intelligence commits to a storyline, apparently it commits completely. Soon came romance, a proposal, wedding preparations. The machine attempted to depict a marriage between a man and a cabbage. Unfortunately, this proved to be one imaginative leap too far. For all its impressive capabilities, artificial intelligence couldn't quite figure out how to visualize that ceremony correctly. Somehow, after creating hundreds of increasingly surreal images, the wedding itself became the moment where technology finally admitted defeat, which, if you think about it, may actually be reassuring. Perhaps humanity still retains one competitive advantage after all. What if computers cannot yet successfully illustrate a legal union between a television presenter and a cabbage? Maybe we still have a little time before they completely replace us. The story didn't even end happily. The imaginary cabbage spouse eventually met a tragic fate after being eaten during a dream-induced midnight snack, an absurd tragedy, a ridiculous emotional arc, and somehow strangely touching. It served as an unexpected reminder that storytelling can emerge almost anywhere, from global politics, from humanitarian crises, or from a computer-generated romance involving vegetables. Yet stepping back, there was one common thread running through everything. Whether discussing Afghanistan's humanitarian emergency or laughing at surreal AI-generated artwork, each story ultimately reflected something deeply human. Our decisions matter. Our attention matters. The stories we choose to tell and the ones we allow ourselves to forget shape how we understand the world. Some stories make us laugh, others demand uncomfortable reflection. The challenge is remembering that the most important stories are not always the loudest. Sometimes they continue unfolding quietly, long after everyone else has stopped watching. And those are often the stories that deserve our attention the most.